Hello and welcome to our daily devotion from Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm Pastor Adam Moline. You'll notice that today I'm not standing up in the pulpit and I'm not robed either in the vestments of our church. Instead, today we're going to start a little bit of a new segment. This first one might be a little bit shaky, so you'll just have to bear with me as we do that. But what I'd like to do in the next few weeks and maybe months is to go through some of the different parts of the sanctuary and why they are what they are. Also to talk about how we set up for communion, telling you about all the wonderful things that our altar guild does. I think sometimes they're the unsung heroes of what happens in our worship services. Also to talk about the paraments and the colors that they are, why they are those colors, how we use them, what the different paraments are, and to kind of talk through some of these things of the practical aspect of what we do in our worship services. And so a lot of these things we can talk about, you can learn about if you get yourself a copy of the Altar Guild Manual. It's available from Concordia Publishing House, and it is a great resource. Talks about a lot of these things in a little bit more depth than we'll have time to do here in our daily video devotion. So take a look at that, and if you run into any of the Altar Guild ladies, do tell them thank you for all of the work that they do to help us get ready for our worship services. To start with, in this particular vein, we're going to talk about the sanctuary, what it is, how it's designed, what the different parts of it are, and that will help us understand what's going on in church and in worship. We talked a little bit about this in Bible study several months ago. We talked about how the design of Christian sanctuaries reflects the design of the Jewish temple as it was laid out in the Old Testament times, even the tabernacle before that, and even in the time of Christ. And so, just like the temples, there are two main parts to our church sanctuary. We have these two parts are kind of divided. Let me turn it around here so you can see. We have the altar rail that goes between these two parts. And the first part is the part up here with the altar, still set up for Christmas, although we're heading into Epiphany, and I know that will be changed. Up here inside the altar rail is what we call the chancel. And then out here, where the pews are, and the part that you normally sit in and that you're used to seeing, this is called the nave. These two parts are the main distinctions in the church sanctuary, the chancel and the nave. Now the chancel, which is up in front, gets its name from the Latin word cancelli, which means lattices. And in the old days, instead of the altar rail here dividing the two, there would have been a lattice, kind of a screen that would have separated the two. This again reflecting the ancient design of the tabernacle and the temple, which would have had a curtain, and whether that was a lattice or whatever, separating those two places. The chancel area up in front reminds us of the Holy of Holies, whereas in the back, the narthex, the nave reminds us of the holy place, and it reflects the holy place in the temple, and it's then also where we enter. The entryway, as we come into church and as we enter the building, is known as the narthex, and this is from the ancient Greek word narthex, which came to mean architecturally the porch, the building in the front. And so if you think about an ancient Greek or Roman temple, you'll see in front all of the columns with the steps leading up to that. That is the porch. And in Greek, that word became narthex. The actual etymological source for that word is kind of a funny one. It comes from the Greek word for giant fennel. And this is because in Hesiod's Prometheus story, Prometheus calls down fire from heaven on the porch of the temple through a giant fennel stalk. And so there you go. That word has made it into our English usage even today. And so the narthex is that room out there where we enter, and as we come through the doors of the narthex, in a sense, we're entering from the everyday average world into the presence of God, being made holy by being in his presence. And so the narthex is very important in that regard. Up here then, the chancel is where we have the altar and the pulpit, and then also, I got to turn around the right way, the lectern as well. And we'll talk more about those on an individual basis in future videos as well. So in the back, behind the blue of the background wall there, we also have the sacristy, and we'll get to take a look at there a little bit as we talk about how communion is set up for as well. Now, most sanctuaries that we see in history are rectangular in shape. The long side going this way from the altar back to the narthex, but then many of them are also cross-shaped, as is our own sanctuary. And so cross-shaped ones we have over here, what's known as a transept. And there's two of those, so that when you look at it from above, it is in the shape of a cross. And so that's a little bit about the sanctuary and the words that we use that define what they are and why we have these places. I also want to talk a little bit about the nave that we were talking about earlier. The nave gets its name from the Latin word navis, which stands for ship. And so in a sense, the church, this makes us think back of Noah and the flood, and how in the flood God saved his people from the deluge outside by bringing them safely through the water in Noah's ark. The ship of the church now does the same thing in our world today. And so we use that word nave to describe the building that we're in, the room that we're in, the place where the pews are, where everyone sits. That's the nave. You're in the ship of the church, being brought safely through into eternal life on the other side. So we have the chancel. We have the nave, complete with the transepts on either side. Hopefully we're not getting too dizzy here. Transepts. And out in the front then, the narthex, which is the porch, which is the entryway into the church. And so all of these things are important, and they help us understand why we have the shape that we have for our church sanctuary, why sanctuaries are designed the way they are. And we'll talk more about these things in future videos as well. We'll also take a look at each of these individual sections. We'll talk about the altar. We'll talk about the lectern. We'll talk about the pulpit. We'll talk about all of these things. The last thing I want to say in this particular devotion is that we do have liturgical directions, and this maybe is a little weird. Luckily for us, our liturgical directions match the cardinal directions that as they appear on a map. The sanctuary has the east side, which is where oftentimes the altar is. It is the east side because it makes us think of Jesus rising from the dead, resurrection. The sun comes up in the east, and so that idea is brought through in our church sanctuary as well, where the altar is located on the east side. We then have the narthex, which is located on the west side, the liturgical west side. And that is the entryway, the porch through the narthex into God's presence, looking with our eyes to the east as we enter, making us think as Christians, what's our main focus? It's that Christ has been raised from the dead. We also then have a pulpit side and a lectern side, and we'll talk more about those when we talk about pulpit and lectern in a future video. So I know this one is a little bit dizzying, and there's some pictures that we'll have up here as well as we talk about these things. But we'll continue to look at all the different parts of the church sanctuary. We'll talk about how we set up for communion. We'll talk about the candles and what they symbolize and why we have them. All of these things and more in future videos. God's blessings on your day and on your week.